My business partner of 9 years had me sign paperwork he described as routine. 3 weeks later I found out I had signed away my entire ownership stake to him for $1. Tonight every single story is about a betrayal so calculated that the person doing it had clearly been planning it for a very long time. 5 people who trusted deeply. 5 betrayals they never saw coming. This is the part that gets me every time. Let me take you back to where each of these stories started. My name is Nathan. I am 43 years old. I live in Denver, Colorado, and 14 months ago I discovered that my business partner of 9 years had, 3 weeks earlier, had me sign a document during what he described as routine paperwork related to a bank refinancing that actually transferred my entire 50% ownership stake in our company to him for the nominal sum of $1, a transfer I only discovered when I attempted to access our business bank account for an unrelated matter and found myself locked out entirely. My business partner's name is Gregory. We had co-founded a landscaping and property management company 9 years earlier, building it from a 2-person operation into a business with 15 employees and a solid regional reputation. An operation I had always believed was built on genuine mutual trust and equal partnership. I want to describe the specific circumstances of the signing, because the deception required careful planning to execute successfully. Gregory had approached me on a Friday afternoon, during a particularly busy period when we were juggling several large contracts simultaneously, explaining that our bank required updated signatures on file for a refinancing of our business line of credit, a routine-sounding request given that we had refinanced various business loans several times over our 9 years together. He presented me with a stack of papers, several pages thick, explaining generally what each section covered while I was distracted managing a phone call about a client issue, and I signed where indicated, trusting as I had for 9 years, that Gregory was accurately representing what I was signing. I want to describe the moment I discovered what had actually happened, because it took several confused, increasingly alarming steps before I fully understood the situation. Unable to access our business account online, I called our bank directly, initially assuming a technical error, only to be told that the account's ownership structure had been formally updated 3 weeks earlier, based on documentation showing my complete transfer of ownership to Gregory, documentation that included my genuine signature on what I now understood had been buried within that stack of papers I had signed without reading carefully enough during that Friday afternoon confrontation. With 2 competing crises, I contacted an attorney immediately, and together we reviewed the actual documents I had signed, finding, exactly as the bank had described, a formal ownership transfer agreement, my signature clearly present on the final page, transferring my entire stake for $1, a transaction so nominal it was clearly designed to satisfy legal formality requirements for a transfer rather than representing any genuine payment for what was, by any reasonable business valuation, a company worth well over $1 million given our client base, equipment, and annual revenue. Update. 4 months later, I filed a lawsuit against Gregory within the first month after this discovery, my attorney building a case around fraudulent inducement, arguing that Gregory had deliberately buried the ownership transfer within seemingly routine paperwork specifically to prevent me from carefully reviewing what I was actually signing, a claim supported by the nominal $1 consideration, which no reasonable business valuation could justify for an actual equal partnership transfer. The legal process took considerable time, complicated by Gregory's attorney initially arguing that I had simply failed to read documents I had voluntarily signed, a defense that became harder to sustain once my attorney presented evidence of the specific circumstances Gregory had engineered, including text messages from that Friday showing Gregory deliberately timing the signing request during a period He knew I was distracted with other business matters. The court ultimately ruled in my favor, finding sufficient evidence of fraudulent inducement to void the transfer and restore my original 50% ownership stake. Though the litigation costs and the fundamental breach of trust have made continuing as business partners with Gregory practically and emotionally impossible. We are currently in the process of formally dissolving our partnership, with a court-appointed mediator helping structure either a buyout or a formal split of the company's assets and client relationships, a process expected to take several more months given the complexity of untangling 9 years of intertwined business operations. Gregory buried a betrayal inside routine paperwork, and just like Nathan discovered his betrayal through a locked bank account, the woman in story 2 discovered hers through something she was never supposed to see at all. A document that was accidentally left in a shared printer tray. Wait, this is the part that gets me most. Here is what she found. My name is Karen. I am 45 years old. I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and 12 months ago I discovered a draft estate planning document my sister had accidentally left in a shared printer tray at the office supply store where we had both gone to make copies of unrelated paperwork, a document that revealed she was structuring her will to leave her portion of our jointly owned family property, inherited from our parents under an agreement we had made together to split it equally between our respective children, entirely to her own 2 children, with a specific clause explicitly excluding my children from any inheritance of what we had both understood, verbally and through years of shared discussion, would eventually pass equally to all 4 of our combined children. My sister's name is Diane. We had inherited our parents' lake property jointly 5 years earlier, and had discussed extensively, on multiple occasions witnessed by other family members, our shared intention that this property would eventually pass to all of our children equally, treating it as a family legacy rather than something to be divided along strictly biological lines between our 2 separate branches. I want to describe finding this document, because it happened almost accidentally, printing my own paperwork and noticing an extra page in the tray that wasn't mine, recognizing Diane's handwriting notes in the margins before I fully registered what the document actually was, a draft will prepared by an attorney that specifically and explicitly excluded my children by name from any interest in the property, directing her entire share instead to her own 2 children exclusively. I want to describe what it felt like to read this, standing in a busy office supply store, understanding that my sister had been quietly working with an attorney to formalize an arrangement that directly contradicted years of family conversations we had both participated in about our shared intentions for this property, conversations that had specifically included discussions about ensuring fairness between our children regardless of which branch of the family they belonged to. I confronted Diane directly the following day, bringing the document with me, watching her face shift from initial confusion about how I had obtained it to a defensive acknowledgement once she understood I had genuinely found it by accident, rather than through any deliberate searching of her private affairs. Diane's explanation, once she moved past her initial discomfort at being confronted with evidence of what she had clearly hoped to keep private until after her death, centered on concerns she said she had developed more recently about my son specifically, citing what she characterized as financial irresponsibility on his part that made her uncomfortable with him eventually having any ownership stake in the property, concerns she acknowledged she had never actually discussed with me directly, despite having apparently been developing this alternative estate plan for several months. Update 4 months later. Diane and I have had several extremely difficult conversations since this discovery, Conversations that have revealed her concerns about my son were based on incomplete or exaggerated information she had received secondhand rather than any direct understanding of his actual financial situation, which, while not perfect, did not remotely justify the complete exclusion she had been planning. We ultimately reached a modified agreement, formalized through both of our attorneys, that maintains the original intention of eventual equal distribution among all 4 children, though structured with some additional protective provisions Diane requested regarding how any inherited interest would be managed, provisions I agreed to given that they addressed her stated concerns without completely excluding my children from what we had both always intended to be a shared family legacy. My relationship with Diane remains strained despite this resolution. While I understand intellectually her stated concerns about financial responsibility, I continue to struggle with the fact that she chose to quietly work around our agreement rather than raising her concerns with me directly, a choice that suggested she anticipated I would disagree with her assessment and preferred avoiding that conversation entirely rather than risking a disagreement that might have been resolved through honest discussion rather than months of secret legal planning I only discovered through pure accident. Diane worked quietly for months to undo a promise she had made out loud. Our third story tonight is about a promise that was also undone, but this time the person doing it did not need an attorney or paperwork or months of planning. She needed only a single phone call made behind her sister's back to someone who trusted her completely. This is the part that stays with me. Here is what happened. My name is Melissa. I am 37 years old, I live in Portland, Oregon, and 10 months ago I discovered that my sister had contacted the adoption agency handling my son's adoption, approximately 6 weeks before the finalization hearing, expressing what she characterized to the agency as family concerns about my suitability as an adoptive parent, an action that nearly delayed the finalization process and that I only discovered when my adoption attorney mentioned, during what I believed would be a routine final preparation meeting, that the agency had received and investigated an anonymous concern that had ultimately been dismissed as unfounded, prompting me to ask enough questions to eventually trace the concern back to my own sister. My sister's name is Amanda. I had been pursuing adoption as a single parent for over 2 years, a process Amanda had throughout expressed what I understood at the time to be genuine support for, attending my baby shower for my son's placement, offering to help with childcare, and generally presenting herself as an enthusiastic aunt-to-be rather than someone harboring serious reservations about whether I should be allowed to adopt at all. I want to describe the specific mechanism through which I discovered Amanda's involvement, because the agency, following standard protocol, would not initially reveal who had raised the concern, citing confidentiality policies designed to protect anyone reporting genuine safety issues. However, once my attorney explained the general nature of the concern, raised specific details about my work schedule and my history of anxiety treatment years earlier, details that only a small number of people, including Amanda specifically, would have known with the particular framing used in the complaint, I became increasingly confident about the source even before I had definitive confirmation. I confronted Amanda directly, and her reaction, immediate and visible guilt rather than confusion, confirmed what I had already suspected before she said anything substantive. She eventually acknowledged making the call, explaining that she had developed genuine concerns over recent months about whether I was truly prepared for single parenthood, concerns she said she had wanted to raise through what she believed was an appropriate channel rather than directly confronting me, having convinced herself in her explanation that the adoption agency would conduct their own independent investigation and either validate or dismiss her concerns objectively, rather than Understanding the significant delay and distress this could cause to a process I had already invested years of my life and considerable emotional and financial resources into completing. Update: 4 months later. My son's adoption was ultimately finalized only 3 weeks later than originally scheduled, the agency's investigation into Amanda's concerns concluding relatively quickly once they interviewed my references, my therapist regarding my historical anxiety treatment, which had been successfully resolved years earlier and posed no ongoing concern to my parenting capacity, and my actual documented childcare arrangements, all of which supported my suitability as an adoptive parent despite Amanda's attempt to introduce doubt through what I now understand was a maneuver she believed would be anonymous and therefore consequence-free for our relationship. I have significantly limited contact with Amanda since fully understanding what she did, unable to reconcile the version of my sister who attended my baby shower with genuine apparent enthusiasm with the version who was simultaneously working, behind my back, to potentially derail the entire adoption process based on concerns she never once raised with me directly despite numerous opportunities to do so throughout the 2 years I had been openly discussing my adoption journey with her. Amanda has expressed regret about the method she chose, though her continued insistence that her underlying concerns were legitimate, rather than fully acknowledging that even legitimate concerns should have been raised through honest direct conversation rather than an anonymous complaint to strangers who held significant power over whether I would be allowed to become my son's mother, has made genuine reconciliation feel, for now, considerably more distant than I would prefer. Amanda tried to stop an adoption through an anonymous complaint. Our fourth story tonight is about a different kind of anonymous betrayal, one that did not target a life event. It targeted a reputation built over an entire career, and it was executed through something the victim had never even considered checking. Wait, let that sink in. Here is what happened. My name is Andrew. I am 34 years old. I live in Richmond, Virginia, and 9 months ago I discovered, through a technical glitch on a professional review platform that briefly revealed reviewer account information that should have remained anonymous, that my longtime professional mentor had been writing anonymous negative reviews of my independent consulting work for approximately 3 years, criticisms that had appeared periodically on industry platforms where potential clients researched consultants before hiring. Reviews I had always assumed, when I noticed them at all, came from genuinely dissatisfied former clients rather than from someone who had, throughout this same period, continued presenting herself as my professional champion, an advocate. My mentor's name is Susan. She had guided my early career for over 8 years, providing genuine, valuable mentorship during my first several years in the consulting field. Mentorship I had always credited significantly for my eventual professional success and independence. I want to describe the technical glitch that revealed this information, because it was genuinely accidental rather than any deliberate investigation on my part. A platform update that briefly displayed reviewer account details that were supposed to remain permanently hidden, details I happened to notice while reviewing my own professional profile for an unrelated update, recognizing Susan's account information attached to 3 separate negative reviews I had previously read without any idea of their actual source. I want to describe what it felt like to understand that reviews I had read over the preceding 3 years, reviews that had specifically criticized aspects of my work in ways that felt, even at the time, somewhat inconsistent with actual client feedback I had received directly, had actually come from my own mentor, someone who had continued throughout this same period, taking public credit for my professional development and presenting our relationship in industry circles as an ongoing mentorship success story. I confronted Susan directly, presenting the account information I had briefly glimpsed before the platform corrected its glitch, watching her attempt initial denial before the specificity of what I had seen made continued denial impossible to sustain credibly. Her eventual explanation centered on what she described as growing professional insecurity as my independent success had begun to eclipse her own consulting practice in certain market segments. Insecurity, she said, had led her, gradually and in ways she claimed even surprised herself, toward actions designed to subtly undermine my growing reputation while maintaining, in every direct interaction between us, the supportive mentor relationship I had always believed was genuine and uncomplicated. Update: 4 months later. I ended my professional relationship with Susan immediately following this discovery, and have spent considerable time since working to address the reputational damage her anonymous reviews caused, including reaching out directly to several clients I believe may have seen these reviews during their decision-making process, providing additional references and context that several told me they appreciated, given that the reviews in question had struck some of them as somewhat vague or inconsistent with Susan's own separately expressed public praise for my work, an inconsistency that, in retrospect, several potential clients told me had actually raised some quiet doubts about the review's authenticity even before I understood their true source. I have not pursued any formal legal action against Susan, my attorney advising that proving quantifiable damages from anonymous online reviews would be difficult despite the clear ethical violation involved, though I have shared what I discovered with several mutual professional contacts, understanding that this information, once known, would likely affect how others in our industry perceive Susan undermined the very career she claimed to champion. Our final story tonight, Story 5, is about a betrayal that targeted something even more personal than a career or an inheritance. It targeted a wedding, not through sabotage, through something far more insidious, a calculated campaign of doubt, planted carefully, over many months, by someone the bride trusted completely. This is the last story, and it may be the most calculated betrayal you hear tonight. Here is what happened. My name is Victoria. I am 31 years old. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, and 11 months ago I discovered, through a credit card statement I glimpsed while helping my fiancé's mother with an unrelated errand, a series of restaurant charges over the preceding 6 months that traced back to regular meetings between her and my fiancé's ex-girlfriend, meetings I subsequently learned had been specifically focused on encouraging this ex-girlfriend to reach out to my fiancé and attempt to rekindle their previous relationship. Before our upcoming wedding, an active campaign my future mother-in-law had been quietly orchestrating despite consistently presenting herself, in every direct interaction with me, as warmly supportive of our engagement. My fiancé's name is Daniel, and his mother's name is Patricia. I want to describe finding this initial evidence, because it happened almost incidentally, glancing at Patricia's credit card statement while helping her resolve an unrelated billing dispute, noticing a pattern of recurring charges at a specific restaurant, charges that seemed unusually frequent for what I understood to be Patricia's typical dining habits, prompting a curiosity I might not have otherwise pursued if the pattern hadn't seemed so specifically regular. I want to describe what happened when I mentioned this observation casually to Daniel. Charges that seemed unusually frequent for what I understood to be Patricia's typical dining habits, prompting a curiosity I might not have otherwise pursued if the pattern hadn't seemed so specifically regular. I want to describe what happened when I mentioned this observation casually to Daniel, watching his reaction shift from initial confusion to visible discomfort as he began piecing together information he had apparently been keeping from me himself, eventually revealing that his ex-girlfriend, a woman named Ashley, had indeed reached out to him several times over recent months, contact he had not disclosed to me because, He explained. He had firmly rejected her attempts each time and hadn't wanted to cause unnecessary worry about a situation he considered fully resolved on his end. This revelation from Daniel, while itself concerning given his choice not to disclose Ashley's contact attempts, led us together to investigate further, ultimately confirming, through direct confrontation with Patricia once we had gathered enough evidence to make denial difficult, that she had been actively facilitating these contacts, meeting with Ashley regularly to discuss strategies for reconnecting with Daniel, providing Ashley with information about our wedding planning progress and encouraging her to make one final significant effort before our wedding date arrived, believing, as Patricia eventually explained through considerable defensive justification, that Ashley represented a better match for Daniel than I did. Based on family background compatibility, she felt more comfortable within what she perceived as differences between my family and theirs. Update. 4 months later. I ended my engagement to Daniel 2 months after this discovery, not primarily because of Patricia's actions themselves, but because Daniel's response to fully understanding what his mother had done felt, to me, insufficiently decisive. Maintaining regular contact with Patricia without establishing what I considered necessary boundaries given the scope of her interference, and expressing what felt like more concern about managing tension between his mother and me than about fully reckoning with what she had actually attempted to do to our relationship. Daniel has reached out several times since our breakup, expressing that he has since had more direct and difficult conversations with Patricia about her behavior. Conversations he says have resulted in genuine boundary setting on his part, information I have received without any current intention of reconsidering our relationship, having concluded that the specific way he initially handled discovering his mother's interference revealed something about his conflict avoidance patterns that concerns me independent of whether Patricia's specific campaign was ultimately unsuccessful. I have had no direct contact with Patricia since our confrontation, and Ashley, according to information relayed through mutual acquaintances, apparently ended her own involvement in Patricia's campaign once she understood the extent of the manipulation Patricia had been orchestrating, expressing what I've been told was genuine discomfort at having been used as an instrument in an older woman's calculated attempt to derail someone else's wedding rather than any organic romantic reconnection Ashley herself had initially believed she was pursuing. That's all 5 stories tonight. If any of these hit close to home, let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you want more stories like this, every single day hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. A like on this video helps YouTube show it to more people who might need to hear one of these stories. Tonight, tomorrow's video has a story that might be the most shocking one I've shared yet, so make sure you're subscribed to catch it. Thank you so much for watching.